I love a holiday tradition. The anime trope of a Christmas episode is right up there with the obligatory trip to the beach. But why? Christianity isn't widely practiced in Japan. Meanwhile, like any good Midwestern boy, I was encouraged, to attend church and learn about the faith's great history. So I decided to learn what Japan's deal with Christmas is. And it turns out not only is it centuries in the making, but is directly responsible for a few of our own traditions here in the West. But before we can get into that, we have to know how the heck Christmas got to Japan in the first place. Assuming you're vaguely aware of Christmas, we'll fast forward through Christianity's spread from the Roman Empire, the Dark Ages, Dante Alighieri putting some of the popes in hell. That's real. Look it up. To around 50 years before Shakespeare's first plays. In 1543, a typhoon blew a Portuguese trading ship into one of Japan's islands. The Japanese weren't super thrilled, but once more formal trade was established, European goods and culture became a novelty. Imagine someone being handed a cup of red wine for the first time.
What the hell is this stuff? It's red.
It was only 6 years after that crash landing, Francis Xavier, a Jesuit priest, arrived to spread the Gospels to this untapped vein of potential converts, with Japan's first Christmas Mass reportedly being performed in 1552. This is about 70 years before, as Cole Porter would say, Plymouth Rock landed on the Pilgrims. And as a fun anime fact, Samurai Champloo makes a reference to Francis Xavier in the episode Unholy Union. But as the civil wars of the Sengoku period came to a close, where the anime Yasuke begins, Japan became more unified under the Tokugawa shogunate, just a few years after all that John Blackthorne business in Shogun. The shogunate wasn't terribly fond of Christians. Even in the previous government, it was wary, passing but never enforcing the Christian expulsion edict in 1587. The logic was that if their allegiance to a god superseded the shogunate's, they couldn't be ruled. Unfortunately, the decades that followed would include more persecution for Christians, and eventually lead to the Shimabara Rebellion, where Japanese Catholics attempted to overthrow the lord of the Shimabara region and failed. A year later, in 1639, the Portuguese were expelled, and all Japanese Christians were forced to renounce their faith, or, Thus began 2 centuries of isolation that you've probably seen depicted in things like Blue Eye Samurai and Martin Scorsese's film Silence. While we've got some more history to cover between this and Tuxedo Mask cosplaying as Saint Nick, I want to point out that Japan, going from almost biblical levels of religious persecution to embracing that religion's first or second most important holiday, is kind of like Salem, going from putting women on trial in religious kangaroo courts to dressing up as what those women were accused of being and handing out candy. For fun. People are weird. None of this is meant to paint Japan in a bad light. The history of the world is long, and as I pointed out, Christians haven't batted 1,000 either. But practicing Christianity in Japan wouldn't be legal until 1873, after the shogunate was overthrown and the Meiji Restoration began. This is about 20 years after America's Commodore Perry aggressively persuaded Japan to trade with the US. For some anime representation of this era, Rurouni Kenshin takes place during the Meiji Restoration, and in the 1996 version's episode, Sanosuke's Tears, we have a fictionalized Second Shimabara Rebellion plotline. But I'm kind of tired of martyrdom. You know what I want to see? Demon Slayer's Nezuko in a Santa hat. She'd be so friggin' adorable. And if Tanjiro's family wasn't so poor and in the sticks, she just might have had one. Demon Slayer is set in the Taisho era. We know this because every damned episode ends with a Taisho secret. Here's a Taisho secret for you, Tanjiro. Christmas decorations first made an appearance in 1900 at the Japanese department store Meiji in Ginza. Meiji's founder, Isuno Hakaru, had studied in England and apparently liked the holiday season so much, it grew 3 sizes in his heart by the time he brought it back to Japan. The lights and decorations must have been pretty cool, because Kinoshita Regan, a poet of the time, supposedly made a reference in one of his Tonka-style poems. This is also the same era the Japanese Christmas cake was popularized. In 1910, the European-styled pastry shop Fujiya created a cake with dried fruit and sugar Of all of the Christmas desserts, Japan co-opted the Christmas doorstop fruit cake. Anyway, it was Emperor Taisho's passing on December 25th, 1926, that gave Christmas a cultural foothold and boost. In honor of Taisho's passing, a festival day was dedicated on December 25th. While officially intended to be a somber day, it seems kind of like how the European church co-opted Saturnalia.
A winter festival where men gave gifts to each other. They also would get...
Oh god. I don't sound like that, do I? I mean, you're still watching, so... Before we get into the final era, for better or worse, it cannot be overstated how influential America has been on Japan in the wake of World War II. That said, American influence on Christmas in the Showa era really kicked into gear when MacArthur announced amnesty for Japanese soldiers on Christmas 1949. But I would prefer to look at anthropologist David Plath's work, specifically his deep dive into Christmas in Japan's Nagano Prefecture in 1963. Anime context would be a setting similar to My Neighbor Totoro. His first few observations include that Japan uses December 25th, the Anglo-American date, instead of the Dutch feast of Sinterklaas on December 5th, which is an interesting point considering the Dutch were the only European foreigners trading with Japan during that isolationist period we talked about earlier. And he continues our Meiji observations. In the downtown stores and streets of Tokyo or Osaka, the decorative trees, Santas, angels, and candy canes are every bit as gigantic as in Chicago or San Francisco. And here we go. Rather than a Christmas goose, families enjoy a Christmas cake. But, it wasn't a fruitcake. Apparently after the rationing from the war ended and refrigeration became more prevalent, whipped cream became more popular and available. Finally, Plath points out that Santa Kurisu no Ojisa, in my butchered Japanese, Grandpa Santa Claus, was the star, along with the ecclesiastical music of Rudolph, White Christmas, and Jingle Bells. Was that sarcasm, David? In an academic paper?
You're on the naughty list.
It was between this snark in the 60s and the end of the 80s where Christmas became commonly and intensely commercialized. This is also where the holiday became less about family celebration and more about romance. You can blame the Showa era for every anime that has any romantic anxiety about Christmas. Blasting through 400 years of history and it's at last, anime time. I wanted to find not only a list of Japanese and Western animation about the holiday, but to find the oldest of each, and then things got weird. For Western animation, the oldest televised Christmas special I found was this animated music video for Frosty the Snowman from 1954. I'm sure you're thinking, what about Charlie Brown? It actually wasn't the first full-length American Christmas special. That belongs to an adaptation of A Christmas Carol with Mr. Magoo from 1962. A Charlie Brown Christmas wouldn't air until December 9th, 1965, and Rankin Bass's Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer was in between, in 1964. Here's the part that'll rile up some Peanuts fans. If you're willing to set aside Frosty's AMV, Mr. Magoo, and Rudolph, anime beat our beloved Charlie Brown to the proverbial Christmas football, because in December 1964, Astro Boy would air its 100th episode in Japan, The Wonderful Christmas Present. And as a final kick in our American holiday pants, those Rankin Bass specials, like Rudolph? Well, David Plath's commentary on the popularity of Santa Claus in 1960s Japan makes a lot more sense once you know that a lot of our favorite holiday specials were animated, stop-motioned, by Japanese studios. MOM Productions, run by Tadahito Mochinaga, had partnered with Rankin Bass on The New Adventures of Pinocchio back in 1960, later working on the aforementioned Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Santa Claus Has Come to Town. Lesser-known works like The Stingiest Man in Town were collaborations with Studio Topcraft, where Hayao Miyazaki worked prior to Studio Ghibli. Don't get me wrong, I'd rather watch Charlie Brown over Astro Boy, and I run a YouTube channel about anime. Linus quotes scripture from Luke, and I start blubbering. And whether or not that's leftover religious trauma or genuine emotion is something I'm working on with my therapist. But there are a lot of anime that have Christmas episodes or take place at Christmas, and since we're all about to spend a lot of time with family and will probably need to dissociate, here are a few that I think are great. Tokyo Godfathers. It's a 2003 Satoshi Kon film about 3 unhoused folks in Tokyo that find an abandoned newborn baby at Christmas time. It's poignant, human, and lovely. An embodiment of the Beatitudes just in time for the season of eternal hope. Hope for a future that holds redemption, where the last can be first, and the meek may finally inherit the earth. But it's not humorless. Were I to do my standard similar Western work to this anime, I'd say it's a Christmas cross between 3 Men and a Baby and Raising Arizona, which I now realize both of these stories about suddenly having a baby came out in the same year. Shifting to fit into the modern romantic themes of Japanese Christmas, Toradora. On the surface, it's a standard run-of-the-mill rom-com. Ryuji likes Taiga's best friend, and Taiga likes Ryuji's best friend, so they strive to be each other's wingman. As the show progresses, though, we see the real and complicated emotions that come with growing up, both from our high school protagonists and their lackluster families. Its Christmas episode is heartfelt and, like Tokyo Godfathers, reminds us that not everyone's holiday is merry and bright. Finally, a fun anime movie that even your uber-religious mother might be convinced to let you watch. Saint Young Men. It's a slice of life where you see a year in the life of Jesus and Buddha as roommates in Japan. It's a funny movie regardless, but if you're familiar with either faith, you'll get plenty of referential gags like Jesus relating to a mob boss about being in prison. Plus, Christmas in Japan. But no matter where you are, happy holidays. Okay, the last video is done, the decorations are up, oh, the gifts for the family are bought, and oh crap, I forgot to get sweet little baby Jesus a present. Lord Santa, if you're out there, I need a favor.
You're on the naughty list.
Aw, nuts.